We are going to Texas today, guys. Get your 10-gallon hats and six-shooter guns ready. We are looking to Texas and beyond. All right, in all seriousness, what we're looking at here is the beginning of the end of pre-Civil War America. All right, we're going to see what's happening in Texas, how it wound up in the U.S., and how that's led into some other issues that really expose this sectional tension that's been building up to this point, and how that really fed into the beginning of the end of pre-Civil War America. We'll look at a little context as always, and then we'll look at messing with Texas, even though we were never supposed to do that. And then we'll look at the Mexican-American War, which is a direct result of messing with Texas, and then the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. So we know that in the first half of the 19th century, Americans both in North and South had been promoting expanding out to the West. Remember, we'd seen that in the North, people wanted access to more industrial zones as well as more raw materials to use for manufacturing. In the South, people primarily wanted more land for farming, especially cotton farming. So everybody, for the most part in the U.S., is on board with expanding the nation. But within the early 1800s, there's also this idea that came about referred to as manifest destiny. I'm sure we've all heard this term at some point. Maybe your experience is slightly different, but I'd imagine it was around the same, that when I was in high school, we basically got taught the U.S. Western expansion based around this idea of manifest destiny. Okay, that kind of was the explanation for why the U.S. expanded out into the West. And I'm going to push back against that quite a bit. All right, so manifest destiny, of course, refers to this idea that there's some kind of God-given right or duty of the United States to expand out into the West and to expand their influence elsewhere. Manifest destiny in particular was based around the idea of spreading the U.S. from one coast all the way out to the other coast. So from east to west, sea to shining sea, Atlantic to Pacific. And again, manifest destiny is based on this idea that there's a God-given right and duty to do this. This is based very heavily on those ideas of American exceptionalism that were coming about after the War of 1812, and also very clearly based on ideas of cultural superiority, suggesting that it's kind of the destiny of the superior American culture, quote unquote, to move out into the West and to displace these savage Indians and the Mexicans who are not quite as superior as the Americans. I'm saying all this very sarcastically, of course. That's kind of the belief around manifest destiny. All right. And it's true that there was this guy, John O'Sullivan, who coined that phrase manifest destiny, and that was the basis of the idea. And we certainly do see some politicians using that word in writings and things. But for the most part, it seems that we've largely overplayed the importance of manifest destiny moving forward. Okay, and that's kind of convenient. The whole purpose of this seems to be that it's more of a convenient rationalization for what westward expansion entailed. Okay, to say that, oh, we're on this God-given mission to go do the things we need to do. That kind of cleans politicians' hands of saying, yeah, go remove all the people you need to, kill whoever you need to. And also looking back in history, we could say, oh, well, maybe we could see that they are not quite accurate, but they believed that they were a part of some kind of God-given vision. Therefore, it's justified to go killing all these people and kicking them out of their homes. If we look, though, at the records of common people and at what they're doing there, majority of people on the ground carrying out this expansion did not seem interested in any kind of God-given idea. They were more interested in things like getting economic gain by going out and starting farms, or maybe to escape hardships out in the East. They wanted to move out West to get a fresh start. So this idea of manifest destiny, while it was definitely prevalent, there was writing about it, it's been largely blown out of proportion when we look back to history. Around the time that this idea of manifest destiny was becoming popular, or that excuse is being used, and there's a lot of people promoting this idea of expansion, people started to look to Texas here, which is a part of the northern part of the Spanish Empire, northern part of Mexico, which at this time was still controlled by Spain. And there were very few Spanish settlements in Texas, very few Spanish subjects living here in Texas by the 1820s. Reason for that was Texas overlapped with Comancheria, which was the domain of the Comanche Empire. Remember the Comanches we looked at before had dominated the Southwest borderlands area here through things like extensive trade networks, as well as forming alliances, bringing other people into their civilization, and also, of course, through very brutal raiding and warfare. So a lot of Spaniards were kind of hesitant to settle up in this area because they knew they'd have to be fighting Comanches constantly, as well as other Plains Indian groups. And the Spanish refused, though, to give up on Texas because they thought it was valuable for protecting more valuable territory further south. Okay, the only reason they didn't give up on Texas much earlier on is because there was a small French presence in Texas. So they said, oh, other Europeans in Texas, we can't let them be getting too close to our valuable silver mines and other things we have further south. Now the U.S. is moving into this Louisiana territory here. They're getting pretty close to Spanish territory. And again, they say, we don't care so much about this region here, but it helps provide a barrier between us and our silver mines down here. Okay. So they basically want to keep Texas as a way to keep the U.S. and Indian groups from coming further south into Mexico where they got silver and other very valuable goods. And as the U.S. is looking to Texas saying there's not a whole lot of settlement there, Spain clearly would like to have more non-Indian settlement there. We also would like to go there, all right? Especially a lot of cotton farmers in the U.S. are saying that is prime farmland there we could move on to. And remember, there had been that cotton revolution in kind of happening at the same time as the market revolution. Well, as a result of that cotton revolution, there was so much cotton being produced, there was overproduction and cotton ended up losing its value. And that led to some real economic hardships in the U.S., referred to as the economic panic of 1819. So there's a lot of cotton farmers who have a lot of cotton, but they're falling into debt, and a lot of them are finding themselves in real tough situations economically. So they're saying, why don't we go and start afresh in Texas? There's other people who just had legal troubles. Maybe they had a bad marriage, some kind of situation they wanted to escape. And they say, hey, here's this territory here that Spain doesn't have very firm control over. Why don't we just go settle there? So there's a series of what were referred to as filibusters from the United States into Texas throughout the early 19th century. Filibusters is a term you may have come across before in a political science class or maybe your high school government class. It has multiple meanings, okay? So we're not talking here about what the Senate can do to hold up legislation where they just sit there talking about nonsense for however long it takes to hold up legislation. This is something completely different, okay? What we're talking about here is a series of expeditions led by people from one country into another country's territory to try to make land claims there. So in this case in particular, what we're seeing is people from the U.S. without the sanction of the U.S. government are coming down into Mexico, fighting battles pretty much to try to stake claims over certain lands there. A great example we can think of to kind of understand the concept of a filibuster is that first Seminole War. Remember, without the sanction from the U.S. government, Andrew Jackson had crossed down into Spanish Florida, started occupying cities. That is a filibuster by definition there. And there was a guy in the U.S. who had fallen on some hard times economically named Moses Austin. And he went to the Spanish government and proposed a plan to them. He said, look, y'all got a problem. Me and a lot of other people in the U.S. have problems. You have this vast territory that you would like to have a lot of non-Indians living in, but not many people from your empire are willing to move up there because they're all kind of set where they're at. They say, what's the point in moving up into this barren wasteland where we're going to be killed by Indians all the time? No, we're not going to move there. But we have a lot of people here in the U.S. who clearly would like to be there. And as you're seeing, they're already making it happen with or without your permission. So do you really want to keep having these filibusters come in? Or would you rather allow us to come settle here? And the Spanish government thought this through and they said, well, we don't really have a better alternative. And if we just leave things the way they are, eventually the Comanches and other Indians are going to have full control of Texas. So I guess you guys can come on in and set up some colonies under some conditions. I'm going to wait to get to those conditions. But they're going to allow now Moses Austin to start this project of colonizing Texas, right? Establishing colonies in Texas, bringing people from the U.S. as well as certain parts of Europe into Texas. Problem was Moses Austin caught pneumonia very shortly after making this agreement with the Spanish government, and he ended up dying. But his son, Stephen F. Austin, took over the project and continued with this effort to colonize Texas. Problem was, now Stephen F. Austin has this contract with the Spanish government to come colonize in Texas. But as that was happening, there was a war for independence being fought in Mexico, and Mexico ended up securing independence by 1821, forming an independent nation of Mexico. So now the question is, where do we stand with this colonization project? They had made this agreement with the Spanish government. Now there's a new Mexican government that may or may not be on board with this. So they received help from a lot of prominent Tejanos who approved of having colonization in Texas, all right? Tejanos, by the way, are people of Spanish descent living in Texas, later of Mexican descent living in Texas. But there were some wealthy Tejanos, people like Jose Antonio Navarro and Erasmo Seguin, who recognized the potential economic benefits of having all these cotton farmers move into Texas. So they did not want this plan to fall through because of this Mexican War for Independence. So they spoke on behalf of these people wanting to colonize Texas. Okay, they went and petitioned to the Mexican government in favor of colonization. And the Mexican government again said, well, our least bad option, okay. And they agreed to let this colonization plan go on. As a result of all of this, Stephen F. Austin became the first, what was referred to as an impresario. Impresario is basically a colonization agent. There are people who established colonies. They were granted kind of tracts of land where they could have a colony here in Mexico, and they would bring in people to colonize those colonies. So Austin, for example, brought the first kind of 300 Christian families, primarily from the United States, here into his colony in Texas. And then several other impresarios later down the road would be granted their own little tracts of land where they could establish colonies as well. Majority of these people are coming from the southern United States. Again, a lot of cotton farmers wanting to have a new economic start here. There are people, though, from Europe and from other parts of the U.S. as well coming in here. Now, there are some problems for a lot of these cotton farmers, okay? A lot of them are very heavily dependent on what they called the peculiar institution. That was their nice little way of justifying slavery. Okay, so they're talking about slavery here. When we talk about the peculiar institution, that's what we're referring to. They're saying it's peculiar to the South and to the people who practice it, that nobody else could understand it. That's why there's so many people opposed to it. But trust us, there's a reason for it. Okay, that's their justification. And there had been a series of political coups in Mexico that seemed to kind of threaten their ability to hold on to slavery and really to hold on to their colonies at all there in Texas. So throughout the early years of its existence, Mexico kind of played a game of revolving presidents, or as one of my colleagues says, they were playing musical presidents, all right? So they were having coup after coup after coup with presidents replacing each other, largely as a result of disputed elections. Again, maybe showing us just how significant that election of 1800 was in the U.S. But anyway, they're shifting pretty much back and forth between factions of federalists. Federalists, we kind of understand from the U.S. sense, being type of government, remember, where there's shared power between state governments and federal governments. So really, federalism here would mean more local control. I mean, the states can make decisions for themselves. And they were frequently being fought by centralists, who were people who advocated having a firm central authority over all of Mexico. And Texians and the prominent Tejanos, who were their allies, supported federalism primarily, because they wanted to have local control of government so they could maintain this peculiar institution here in Texas, all right? We need to understand that as part of the Mexican War for Independence, there had been all kinds of talk about ending slavery, okay? A big basis of the Mexican War for Independence had been fighting against socioeconomic and racial divisions within Mexican society. So they're wanting more racial equality. They're wanting more liberty for all people. And there are parts of Mexico that are already starting to push for ending slavery. So again, they turned to their prominent Tejano allies, people like Erasmo Seguin and Jose Antonio Navarro, to continue petitioning the Mexican government on their behalf. And they kept saying, look, we need to keep slavery here because that's what's going to allow these Americans to keep coming. That's kind of their incentive to be here. So we've got to keep this. They also would petition for Texas to separate from its neighboring state of Coahuila. Coahuila was a state right south of Texas that had been merged with Texas under one of these regimes that came into power through these series of revolving governments. And Texas was wanting to separate from that southern state of Coahuila and be their own state. Reason being is they were afraid that people in Coahuila really had no incentive to support things like maintaining American colonization and immigration and maintaining slavery in Texas because they're not getting as much of the economic benefit. So what do they care? And that made them afraid that they may vote against slavery and against American immigration, continued American immigration, that is, into Texas. So another thing that the Tejanos were petitioning for was to separate Texas from Coahuila. This, honestly, here was the big kind of basis of early tensions within Texas, was wanting to separate from Coahuila. Real big spark, though, that set off a lot of tensions that have been building as a result of these political disputes and kind of fear of losing control of Texas, especially losing control of having slavery in Texas, came with the law of April 6, 1830, which was passed under one of these centralist regimes. This law banned slavery in Texas and really all forms of servitude. Reason they had to be real specific about banning all forms of servitude is because there had been earlier efforts to ban slavery. So Texas just kept bringing in more people and calling them things like indentured servants or people in conditions of servitude, using cute little phrases to dance around the fact that they were still having slavery. So they said, nope, not getting away with that anymore. We're banning all forms of servitude. They further banned any further American immigration into Texas. Said whoever's here can stay, but nobody else can come in. Before I move on, I want to make clear, this is not just unprecedented, okay? There were some conditions upon which these people coming in to colonize Texas were held to, right? There's kind of an agreement. So you can come in and establish these colonies, but there's really three main things you have to agree to. First, we predominantly practice Catholicism in this country. So if you're not already Catholic, you'll have to convert to Catholicism, all right? Do whatever you got to do, go through the process, take some classes, get baptized. Second, our primary language here is Spanish. So if you don't already know Spanish, you need to learn it and you need to be speaking it as much as possible. That needs to become your kind of primary language. Third, if you're bringing anybody else into these colonies, they have to be coming legally. They have to be approved by the Mexican government. Okay, they can't just come on in and say, we're Mexican citizens now. They have to go through a procedure. And all three of these things the Mexican government found were being heavily violated. There's all kinds of people who would come into the colony without being approved by the Mexican government. They weren't practicing Catholicism and they weren't speaking Spanish. So that's really why the Mexican government cracked down here with this law. Furthermore, of course, they're practicing slavery and finding ways to justify that by calling it other things. So a lot of Americans did continue to come into Texas. There were a few more filibusters after this law was passed. But for the most part, this is a pretty strict ban on the things that people are wanting to do here in Texas, and it's really building a lot of tension. Strangely, I know looking forward with what we know now, it seems strange that this would come as a sign of hope, but a sign of hope did come for a lot of Texans and Tejanos when a military commander named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led a coup and installed a new federalist regime in Mexico. Okay, so he overthrew that centralist regime and said, we are now going to be a federalist country once again. For Texans, that means cool. We get local control. We get to make decisions here, and we can rule in favor of having slavery and continued American immigration. Works out for us. But then Santa Anna went and pulled a Santa Anna. All right, what do I mean by that? We got to understand this guy here has a very mixed legacy. Some people see him as a great hero of Mexico. A lot of people, though, see him as a snake in the grass who would do whatever he had to do to protect himself, whatever was in his best interest at the expense of the Mexican people. I lean a lot more toward the latter. And what he did in this situation is he came in as a federalist, right? But then he put his vice president to really run the show, and he said, I'm going to go hang out over here in my hacienda. Good luck with this. And he kind of sat back and watched how things played out. And he saw that under this federalist regime, things were kind of shaky. They weren't working out so well. So he said, okay, I'm going to come in. I'm going to take over now. You're out. And he declared himself a dictator. And he said, by the way, I am now a centralist, and this entire nation is under my control. He took things a step further, and he converted all the states of Mexico into military districts directly under the control of the central government in Mexico City. So directly under his control. Basically threw out their constitution and said, we are now under the centralist dictatorship after declaring himself a federalist. But as the Mexican army was coming in to solidify control over Texas, part of what they were doing to assert their authority over Texas and make it into a military district was to confiscate a cannon which they had given to the Texans to help defend themselves from Indian raids from the Comanches and the other groups who had been raiding into Texas for so long. This little pea shooter cannon here started the Texas Revolution, all right? Because the Texans lined up on one side of the river in Gonzales and held onto this cannon and waved this flag here, kind of taunting the Mexican army, saying, come and take it. The Mexican army stood on the other side of the river and they said, hey, you got to give us that cannon. The Texans said, no, we don't. What you going to do about it? Kind of yelled back and forth. And then they started shooting at each other. A little skirmish back and forth as they're shooting at each other. Nothing major, but we got to keep in mind, now these colonists in Texas have fired on the Mexican army. There's no turning back from that. This was the start of the Texas Revolution. Just like with the American War for Independence, though, the Texas Revolution didn't really start off as a war for independence. Some people were saying, we do want independence. Others were saying, we just want to bring back our federalist government we had before, and we want to separate from the state of Coahuila. There were really two major losses, though, that got more people on board with the idea of independence. One was the Battle of the Alamo, Sure, anybody who's grown up in Texas has some idea of what generally kind of happened here. Even anyone who hasn't has probably at least heard about the Alamo, has a general idea that there was some kind of fight there. So what happened here is a lot of Texians, as well as some Tejanos, took fort in this old Spanish mission called San Antonio de Valero, and they were under the command of William Barrett Travis, as well as another guy named Jim Bowie, who really didn't get to do any fighting because by the time of the real siege of the Alamo, he was on his sick bed, kind of dying. He ended up dying on his sick bed by being killed there. Pretty unfortunate. But they were vastly outnumbered, holed up in this mission, and the Mexican army was marching into San Antonio, starting to surround them. And as word got to the commander of the Texas Army, General Sam Houston, that there's these guys holed up in this old Spanish mission and the Mexican army's marching in, starting to surround them, he sent word down and said, guys, get out of there as fast as you can. You're not going to be able to defend that little fort. It's of no use to us, and you're being surrounded. Get out now. Problem was, the majority of people here at the Alamo were volunteers, okay? For example, we know the great frontiersman Davy Crockett from Tennessee, whoop-hoo, came down here with his rifle, Old Betsy, to defend the Alamo. But Houston, as the commander of the army, only has authority really over the army. So if he tells volunteers to leave, they don't necessarily have to listen. So they said, no, we can hold fort here. We'll hold them off. And they stuck around. And next thing they knew, sure enough, Santa Anna came in with this massive army, had them surrounded, and now they're kind of stuck at the Alamo because they didn't listen to Sam Houston when they had a chance to leave. So really, this kind of gets blown out of proportion and romanticized that William Barrett Travis drew a line in the sand with his sword and said, everybody with me, cross over. Anybody who's not, stay here. And all but one coward crossed over the line because they all wanted to sit there and refuse to surrender and fight bravely. By that point, they kind of had no choice but to do that. Okay, they were surrounded by an army who had them vastly outnumbered and outgunned. But Santa Anna led this very devastating assault on the Alamo, led his men over the walls, and he killed every last man there defending the Alamo. All right, he made it clear as he surrounded them that he was going to take no prisoners. That's another reason, really, they had no choice to escape. And he did not take prisoners, right? He came in and killed all the men standing. The only people he kept alive were some women and children who had been there, as well as some enslaved people. Why would it be that he would leave these survivors? If he's very clearly willing to come in and cause chaos and kill every last man standing and not accept surrender, do you really think that he has a big heart and that's why he's letting these people live? Why else might he want to let there be some survivors? He wants there to be some people to spread the message of what exactly happens if you challenge Santa Anna, right? He's letting them know he will come in and kill every last man. And these stories certainly did spread, as did the stories of the Goliad Massacre. So the Goliad Massacre is based around a presidio called La Baya in Goliad, Texas. Presidios, remember, were the forts that kind of served as outposts for the Spanish Empire. There's this abandoned presidio that they had made into a fort, similar to how the people at the Alamo had made the old mission into a fort. And again, Sam Houston sent down orders to them. Guys, the Mexican army is on their way there. This is of no use to us. Don't stay there. Get out of that fort, all right? And in this case, the people there under a guy named James Fannin listened to Sam Houston. And they agreed, okay, this is not in our interest to stay here. Let's retreat. Problem was, long story short, not everybody who was going to be there was there, all right? Some of the people who had been stationed here had gone off on another mission, and they had to wait for those guys to come back to Goliad before they could start their retreat. So it was really several days after Houston ordered them to leave, then they actually retreated, okay? It was several days before they actually left. And then as they're leaving, they realized they were facing some problems. They had some wagons kind of overloaded. They were having some logistical troubles, and they're just moving very slow. And by the time they really got a little ways out, they were intercepted and surrounded by a Mexican army. And the Mexican army fought a little skirmish with them called the Battle of Colito. Nothing major there, just a few guys killed, several people injured, including Fannin himself. And Fannin said, guys, this battle is not worth fighting. We're clearly outnumbered here. Let's surrender. So there was about 300 people there from the Texian army who had surrendered under Fannin, and they were marched back to the Presidio. Okay, and they're hoping, okay, we've surrendered. Maybe they'll give us some mercy and set us some conditions. We'll have to be prisoners for a while, but hey, at least we walk away with our lives. Unfortunately for them, orders came down from Santa Anna to execute all those prisoners. Legend has it when Fannin was executed, they set him down in a chair and they asked him if he had any final requests. there's different interpretations that'll say what exactly those requests are, but they fall somewhat within this line. Okay, he said, one, please let me die with dignity. Shoot me in the heart, not in the face. Two, I have some belongings on me I'd like sent to my wife and my children. And three, please give me a proper Christian burial. Then they proceeded to shoot him in the face, take all his belongings, keep it for themselves, and burn his body. When people heard about these massacres at the Alamo and Goliad, these major losses, that's when people were saying, okay, we really need to be solid about what we're doing here, and started jumping behind the idea of independence. So after these major losses, Sam Houston started a tactical retreat known as the Runaway Scrape. So basically what he was doing here is he was going from settlement to settlement, rounding up settlers saying, guys, y'all got to get out of here, come with us, bring your militia with you because we're going to need all the help we can get. And he'd encourage people to burn down their farms and destroy their homes on the way out the door. The reason he's doing this is he's trying to wear down the Mexican army, okay? If anybody's pursuing him, he doesn't want them to have access to any food. He doesn't want them to have shelter. This is what we call a war of attrition, just trying to wear your enemy down. And then the Texas Army, though, was really upset about this, okay? They had heard about these major losses at Goliad and at the Alamo, and they're wanting to fight. They're wanting to go find the Mexican army and have a battle. So why are we going, slowing ourselves down, getting all these people with us, and making them burn down their homes, when we should be going and taking the Mexican army head on? Houston said, just bear with me, guys. Come with me. I need you to trust me. I've got a plan. I'm convinced he didn't necessarily have a plan, but he had enough blind faith that he knew what he was doing would pay off eventually. And after a long, drawn-out retreat during this runaway scrape, an opportunity did present itself for Sam Houston to help his army kind of calm down, right? They were able to sneak up on the Mexican army directly under Santa Anna, camped out at a town called San Jacinto in East Texas. They snuck up on the Mexican army having a siesta at the town of San Jacinto. A siesta, for anyone who's not familiar with Mexican culture, is a break in the middle of the day where people just kind of take it easy, maybe take a little nap. So the Mexican army was really not expecting them. Santa Anna himself, for example, was hunkered down in a tent with a pretty lady doing God knows what. And by this time, Sam Houston's forces were ready for battle, all right? They were fired up. They were tired of raiding, tired of retreating, and they took advantage of this opportunity, and they stormed in with full force, screaming, remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. And they managed to capture this Mexican army within 20 minutes, okay? Under 20 minutes. There was a band of Tejanos, by the way, though, fighting alongside the Texans, who had to wear cards in their hats so that they wouldn't be shot and mistaken as members of the Mexican army, led by a guy named Juan Seguin. But the Mexican army surrendered in less than 20 minutes. But once they captured the Mexican army, they started looking through all the troops, and they could not find Santa Anna. They knew he had been there, but they couldn't find him. So they realized some of these guys must have ran off and hid in the woods, including Santa Anna himself. So they went out into the woods and they started spying on some Mexican soldiers who they'd found out there who had escaped. And they noticed that there was one guy among those who had fled who everybody was treating real respectfully. Some of them said, hey, I think I even saw one of them salute him. And then they heard one of them call him Presidente, which is Spanish for president. Santa Anna was so full of himself that he was among his privates, disguised as a private, but he blew his own cover by making them still treat him like some kind of superior, having them salute him and call him nice titles, and that's what gave him away. And from there, the Texian army was able to capture him. And a lot of the soldiers of that army were wanting to kill him then and there on the spot, okay? They had waited for their revenge. They're finally getting it. They're still fuming about the Alamo and Goliad. Now they've had this great victory, and they're just on top of the world on cloud nine. They want to just rip this guy's head off. And Sam Houston had to calm them down and say, no, guys. He's worth way more to us alive. We can now use him to negotiate. And that they did. Then in fear for his life, Santa Anna pulls another Santa Anna. He says, well, I should maybe do what's best for the good of Mexico, but I'm more concerned with my own safety. So sure, whatever you guys say, I'll agree to. And he agreed to sign a couple of treaties called the Treaties of Velasco. So there's one public treaty and one private treaty. The public treaty called for an independent Republic of Texas, saying that Mexico would recognize this independent Republic of Texas. And it also extended the border of Texas further south than it had traditionally been. It had always sat at the Nueces River, but some of the Texians negotiating said, we think that border ought to be a little further south at the Rio Grande, giving us more territory. And Santa Anna, kind of again under the pressure of fear for his life, said, okay, yeah, I'll set the border wherever you say. Sure, you wanted the Rio Grande, it's the Rio Grande. Understand though, it had always traditionally been at the Nueces River, right around Corpus Christi and present day Calallen area. This extended border would lead to some major problems moving forward. Not everybody in the Mexican government's going to agree with this, which leads into the private Treaty of Velasco. Santa Anna realized he's kind of talking just to save his own skin, but he said, guys, y'all got to understand, I'm only one member of the Mexican government. There's a whole shebang back home I got to go answer to, and they're not going to be too happy with me giving all this stuff up. So Santa Anna had, remember, pretty much solidified total control over Mexico, but there were still other members of the Mexican government and the Mexican army who he had to keep appeased. If he pushed his luck too far, he might find himself overthrown. So under a private Treaty of Velasco, Santa Anna agreed to go talk with the Mexican government, try to get as many people on board as possible with the agreements that he had made under the public treaty. Okay, so basically the private treaty is just him saying, since I'm talking through my teeth here to save my skin, I'm gonna have to go try to get more support on this. Spoiler alert. The Mexican government is not going to take kindly to this. They're not going to recognize the Republic of Texas as an independent nation, and this is not going to turn out very well. So, this independent Republic of Texas that came from the Texas Revolution really struggled throughout its years of existence, faced all kinds of economic hardship. They also struggled for sovereignty consistently, as we'll see moving forward. Mexico never recognized their sovereignty, for example. They always considered them to just be a state in rebellion. The U.S. would come around to eventually recognizing them, but then when they appealed for annexation, as we'll see, didn't come very easily. They really struggled to get recognition from prominent nations like Britain and France as well. Pretty rough times for this Republic of Texas. Furthermore, we need to be mindful that there were some Americans who seem to have been interested in having Texas become part of the U.S. all along. There are claims that Andrew Jackson had sent Sam Houston down to Texas as part of some conspiracy to try to get him to stir up trouble there, take advantage of the hardships there, so that he could secure Texas for the U.S. There's really no evidence to support that claim, yet there is some evidence that seems to point in the contrary. So I don't know about that, but there certainly were some Americans interested all along in having this nation now, Texas, become part of the U.S. And that certainly increased over time. The desire that is increased over time for people to join the U.S. As this republic struggled as it went forward. And as more and more Texans began supporting annexation, President Sam Houston, who was kind of the leader of the camp of people pushing for annexation, made some appeals to join the U.S. And after a couple unsuccessful attempts at pushing for annexation, he came up with a pretty brilliant strategy. Sam Houston's a very fascinating guy, by the way. Great politician. No matter what you think about him, he's a very brilliant politician. I'll share a little more about him in the next lecture. But what he did is he met with some diplomats from Great Britain, and he exaggerated to them U.S. interests in Texas. So the U.S. had been hesitant, we need to understand, to add Texas to the nation primarily because it would have thrown off the balance of power. Remember, Texas was concerned with preserving slavery, right? It was written actually in the Republic of Texas's Constitution that there could be no changes made to slavery. There could be no threats to slavery. There could be no efforts to prohibit or restrict slavery within that republic. So it's pretty clear that if Texas did end up joining the U.S., they would have joined as a slave state, okay? So that's really why the U.S. was pretty hesitant to bring Texas into the Union. It's really political reasons. But when Houston went and met with British diplomats, he kind of let that piece out. He said, the U.S. is very interested in annexing Texas, but, we're just kind of trying to see what our options are. We got this nice big hunk of territory with all kinds of great natural resources that could be very beneficial to any nation who was interested in perhaps annexing us. Just throwing that out there. And Britain maybe showed the slightest bit of interest. They said, Sam, you do have a nice hunk of land there. You do have some valuable resources. We agree to that. We could see how that could be profitable to us. Boom, there they showed a little bit of interest. But, you also seem to be very invested in slavery here. And throughout the British Empire, we're trying to end slavery. So not so sure that we're interested. We'll get back to you and let you know, but it's probably going to be a no. We're really not interested in adding on a territory that's so invested in slavery. But thanks for the offer. We'll get back to you and let you know for sure, so. And have you ever seen Dumb and Dumber, where the guy asks the girl if he has a chance, or what his chances are with her? And she says, 1 in a million. And he says, wait, you mean I got a chance? That's kind of what Sam Houston did here with Britain. They told him, well, there's a 1 in a million chance we would add you on. So he went and ran with that, took that to the U.S., and he said, hey, I met with some diplomats from Britain. They're very interested in taking on Texas. We'd rather have the U.S. take us on, but we're going to do what's best for us, whoever gives us the better deal. Just throwing that out there. And he knew this would work, and it certainly did. This got the U.S. up in flames. The U.S. wanted to avoid Britain coming in and taking any territory in North America at all costs. Largely because this would have required them to own up to what they had promised in the Monroe Doctrine. Remember where they said that if any European nation came meddling in the Americas, that the U.S. would come to their rescue. And they knew they were really in no position to come and fight off Britain if they chose to come and take over Texas. So they said, we better jump in there and take over Texas before there's any trouble. All right, we need to secure claims to this territory before anybody else like Britain wants to try coming in here and taking it. Of course, again, Britain was not really interested in Texas, maybe the tiniest bit. They did like the idea of having all that cotton coming in, perhaps, but they didn't want to bring in the slavery. But Sam Houston blew it all out of proportion intentionally so that he could get support from the U.S. for annexation. And it worked. The U.S. ended up bringing in Texas by 1845. Of course, don't expect you to remember that year. But Texas was brought into the nation under what's referred to as a joint resolution, meaning just a majority vote of both houses of Congress to vote Texas in automatically as a state. Okay, so it did not have to go through that process of being admitted as a territory and then getting a certain population and blah, 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 blah. Because they already had a pretty big population here, Congress agreed to just bring them in under this joint resolution. And there is a myth we need to clear up here that seems to be based around some things that are included in this joint resolution. All right, as part of the agreements under the joint resolution, Texas was given permission, if it chose to do so, to break up into 5 smaller states, okay, because it was a very large state. But all of those states would have been part of the United States. All right, so no matter what politicians might go out telling you, Texas has never had the legal right to secede from the United States, okay? And doing so would be treason, and it would lead to civil war. So if you ever see some nincompoop driving around with a bumper sticker with a Texas flag that says secede, just know that they are promoting civil war, because that is not legal, and it would be met with military force. All right. Got to clear that up. Problem now, though, the U.S., remember, all along had been hesitant to add Texas to the Union because it would throw off the balance of power. Sure enough, it did. Now they got another slave state coming into the Union. How are they going to make people okay with this? Well, to maintain the balance of power, they created a treaty with Britain known as the Oregon Treaty. So this Oregon territory up in the far northwest had been kind of shared by the U.S. and Britain. And under this Oregon Treaty, they drew a pretty firm line as to what was U.S. territory and what was British territory. And all this U.S. portion of the Oregon Treaty would have the right to come in as free states, okay? So that's kind of creating some free territory that will eventually be free states in exchange for bringing in this very large slave state, kind of easing up that balance of power. We got to keep in mind, though, Mexico never recognized Texas's independence, let alone did they ever recognize U.S. claims to Texas. Furthermore, they're saying that if the U.S. did have some kind of claim over Texas, which they don't recognize, they recognize the border, the southern border of Texas, to be at the Nueces River, where it had always been. Where the U.S. now, under the Treaty of Velasco, signed with Santa Anna, see it at the Rio Grande River, much further south. So they're bringing on a whole lot more territory than had traditionally been part of Texas. And by staking claim over all this territory, Mexico is going to view that as an act of aggression. And this is all going to be disputed territory here between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Things got further complicated between the U.S. and Mexico because the U.S. had a long-time interest in the territories of California and New Mexico. We need to understand that these territories are much bigger than the present-day states of New Mexico and California. These encompass a good chunk of the Southwest borderlands. And why would the U.S. want access to these territories here? Sure, there's manifest destiny, the God-given vision, blah, blah, blah. But as I suggested already, manifest destiny gets a bit overstated. What they're really interested in here is the real golden rule, all right? Meaning that he who has the gold makes the rule. And there's all kinds of resources here in this territory, especially out in California. They also want to get a path and have access out to the Pacific coast. This would give them access all the way out to the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast in the east. Now they got access to ports on both sides for travel, transportation, trade. Boom, they got it set. That is cha-ching in their pocket, baby. So, with their interests here in California and New Mexico, President Polk came and offered to buy Alta California and Nuevo Mexico from Mexico. And Mexico declined. All right. So some people will make the argument, well, the U.S. offered to buy territory from Mexico, and Mexico so stubbornly refused, and that's why the U.S. went to war with them, and they ended up buying it. So maybe Mexico just should have taken the deal in the first place. Guys, if I come and I take a piece of property from you and say, this is mine now, and then I say, hey, I'd also like to buy this other property from you, you are in no way obligated to sell me that other property. And that does not justify me coming and poking you in the eye and saying, okay, now I'd like you to sell me that property. All right. So we need to keep in mind that this Mexican-American war, which we're about to see play out here, so that the U.S. can get a hold of these territories in addition to Texas, is a bit questionable. So with their eyes still on California and Mexico while staking claim over Texas, which Mexico does not recognize, the U.S. decided that they may try to acquire these territories here by provoking a war with Mexico. Okay, they said if they won't sell, we'll make them sell by pressuring them into war. In other words, per my analogy, we'll go poke them in the eye a little bit until they agree to sell. So remember, there's this disputed territory here between what was Texas and what is now Texas. This Nueces Strip between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Mexico is not recognizing as part of Texas, and really they're not recognizing any of Texas as part of the United States. But this territory here is particularly hotly disputed because this is adding a new border to Texas. So the U.S. decided they were going to take advantage of this disputed Nueces Strip here, and they were going to use this to provoke war with Mexico. So what they did is they sent an army commander named Zachary Taylor down into the Corpus Christi area. So there's this marker here in Artesian Park showing you more or less where Zachary Taylor and his army camped. I came across this one night at Art Walk. Just kind of stumbled across it. Long, fun night. And I was like, hey, I've read about this thing. I've even taught about this thing. Here it is. But yeah, you can go see that down at Artesian Park. But now we have Zachary Taylor kind of coming into this disputed territory with his military, showing what are you going to do about this, Mexico? There had already been some little skirmishes here in this territory before this, but this is really the U.S. flexing, saying, we are going to stake claim in this territory. What are you going to do about it? And Mexico eventually, as the U.S. hoped, got pretty fed up with the army being here, and they came and fired on Zachary Taylor's forces, thus provoking the U.S.-Mexican War. Once this army was fired upon, Polk said, well, the Mexican army has not fired on us. What choice do I have? I got to go to war with Mexico. And he called on Congress to declare war with Mexico. Another factor we need to keep in mind, though, that was feeding into these tensions between the U.S. and Mexico was what you read about in the Brian DeLay reading, the War of a Thousand Deserts, right? So this is a term used to refer to the conflicts between Plains Indian groups like the Comanches and the peoples of the northern frontier of the Mexican Empire. So this is referred to as the War of a Thousand Deserts because as Comanches and other Indian groups would come in and raid, and as other groups would attack Comanche settlements, they leave behind these deserted wastelands, essentially, of ransacked towns with no life in sight. And when people would come by and see the aftermath of them, they would describe them as just desert wastelands. And these were occurring throughout the 1830s and 40s as the Comanches were expanding their influence throughout the Southwest borderlands. And the U.S. And Mexico started using Indians kind of as lenses to view each other through. And Mexico started to argue, well, the U.S. is encouraging these Indians to come and raid us. And the U.S., by contrast, would suggest Mexico is doing nothing to defend the people of the northern frontier from these Indian invasions. And the U.S. used this as justification to declare war on Mexico, right? They're saying that Mexico cannot defend their northern frontier. They're allowing the people there to be ransacked. They're allowing these desert wastelands to be created. We have a responsibility to go in and fight off the Comanches and defend that territory for ourselves. Furthermore, by the time the U.S. had declared war on Mexico, the northern Mexican frontier had been greatly weakened by these War of a Thousand Deserts, and it made it a lot easier for the U.S. to come in and seal a victory. I do want us to understand as well, however, Not everybody was on board with this war. There was a good deal of resistance to the Mexican-American War. Clear example we can see was through a congressman known as Abraham Lincoln. Oh, hey, I know that guy. So Lincoln made what was known as the Spot Resolutions, through which he demanded President Polk to come before the House of Representatives and to point on a map where exactly he had made the claim that American blood had been spilled on American soil. Okay, that had been Polk's kind of justification for having war declared on Mexico. He said that they had spilled American blood on American soil, and Lincoln saying, okay, so you come before us then and show us exactly the spot where that happened on a map. And his goal here is clearly to show that where this blood had been spilled was actually disputed territory, and that this was intentionally set up by Polk so that he'd have justification to declare war. Now, Polk found ways to dance around this, and he never actually ended up having to go before Congress and do this. But this is a clear demonstration of resistance from the war, even within the U.S. government, okay? Pretty historically significant. As if I were taking an exam, this is exactly what I would write down, not go writing some random things or finding random things on Google. Another example of resistance to this war came from a famous writer, Henry David Thoreau. So he was arrested for refusing to pay his taxes during this war. So he did not want to pay his taxes because he saw them as supporting the government that was waging this unjust war as he saw it. And when he was arrested for refusing to pay his taxes, he was inspired to write an essay which he titled Civil Disobedience, which kind of laid the groundwork for this concept of civil disobedience. So civil disobedience refers to a moral duty of individuals to resist unjust laws. So it refers to intentionally refusing to comply with unjust laws. And this would be crucial to successes in American activism moving forward. So if we look, for example, to the African American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, this was strongly at play. Okay, this is what people like Dr. Martin Luther King were all about. Rosa Parks, she knew what she was doing, guys, when she sat on that bus. She wasn't just some tired lady on her way home from work. She was doing what she was doing on behalf of all the tired ladies who had been arrested on their way home from work for refusing to give up their bus seats. By that point, she was intentionally violating that law to have a case to make against it. That, my friends, is civil disobedience in a nutshell. But again, what I want us to understand here is that this is a clear example of resistance, in this case, to the Mexican-American War, which would happen to have much longer implications moving forward. Another example of resistance to the Mexican-American War was that there was a large number of dissenters, meaning people who defected from the U.S. Army and in many cases went and joined with the Mexican Army. Clear example would be the San Patricios, or the St. Patrick's Battalion. This was a battalion made primarily of Irish and German immigrants who were, in many cases, coerced by promises of economic incentives from the Mexican Army to come and join their side. But a lot of them willingly chose to join with the Mexican Army because they faced a great deal of nativism, both in the United States and in the U.S. Army. Okay, they were always treated as second class because as Germans and Irish, they were predominantly Catholic. And here's Mexico, this Catholic nation, who they feel they have a lot more in common with than with the U.S., who is treating them as being somehow inferior for being Catholic. A clear example of resistance to the Mexican-American War. All right, so this war was eventually wrapped up when General Winfield Scott, U.S. commander, captured Mexico City. This war was ended by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is where Mexico officially accepted the loss of Texas. And they also recognized the Rio Grande as the border between the U.S. and Mexico, right? So this is why we have the current border we do with Mexico and the U.S. is still a result of this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico also, under this treaty, agreed to sell the New Mexico and California territories to the U.S. Again, this encompassed far more than just the states of New Mexico and California as we know them today. This was a big hunk of the Southwest borderlands. So this led essentially to Mexico giving up about half of their territory. This greatly reduced the size of Mexico, but in turn, this somewhat close to doubled the territory of the U.S. This led to the U.S. acquiring what's now referred to as the Mexican Cession. So anytime moving forward, I use that term Mexican Cession. Please know this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the territory that the U.S. gained from Mexico as a result of the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. One particular aspect of this treaty, though, very clearly demonstrates to us that interconnectedness of the Indian conflicts of the War of a Thousand Deserts and the Mexican American War, definitely demonstrating to us that Indians were key players in this Mexican American War, albeit indirectly. So, Article 11 of the treaty essentially transferred all responsibility of managing warfare with the Indian Plains Indians in the Southwest borderlands to the U.S. All right, saying basically this is your problem now. Pretty fascinating that in this treaty where they're giving up this territory, they felt the need to even include this. The reason this is so fascinating, by the way, guys, is you may not understand. Up until the book, The War of a Thousand Deserts, was written, which was around 2008 or so, Indians' role in the Mexican American War was largely underplayed, if included at all, in historical narratives about this war. So it's kind of a missed piece that we're starting to pick up on if we pay close attention to what happened here. All right. Showing us again, also in the bigger picture, that as long as we're willing to continue studying history, we can pick up on little things that have been missed or overlooked or underplayed or misunderstood over time. All right. Helping us get a better understanding. The last thing we need to look at is the aftermath of this Mexican American War. Let's start by looking at how it impacted Tejanos and other people of Mexican descent living in Texas and in this Mexican cession. So in Texas, Tejanos faced a lot of pressure despite their consistent support for U.S. claims in Texas. Remember, Tejanos had played key roles in petitioning to the Mexican government to get U.S. colonization into Texas and to maintain colonization in Texas, also to maintain slavery, which a lot of colonists from the U.S. Saw as an incentive to come to Texas. Furthermore, Tejanos were directly involved in the Texas Revolution. Despite all of this, after the Texas Revolution and in the years leading into the Mexican War, as well as after the Mexican War, a lot of these Tejanos faced a great deal of discrimination. Clear example we can look at is with somebody named Juan Seguin. So Juan Seguin had, remember, been a hero in the Texas Revolution. We saw that he had participated directly in the Battle of San Jacinto. He led the group of Tejanos who had the cards in their hats. He also had nearly fought in the Alamo, but he had been sent off to seek some reinforcements, and the siege of the Alamo occurred before he could return. But he was a hero in the Battle of San Jacinto. Furthermore, his father, Erasmo Seguin, had been one of those prominent Tejanos who had appealed consistently on behalf of the U.S. to the Mexican government. So his family had a long history of supporting U.S. interests in Mexico, and he had helped fight in the Texas Revolution. Despite all this, after the Texas Revolution, he was pressured to leave Texas by Texas Rangers. Texas Rangers are just kind of like a state militia type group, by the way. Their main purpose was to fight Indians, but they did all kinds of crazy things. Anything that involved killing people, Texas Rangers could be involved in. But once again, under all this pressure, fled to Mexico, and this was during the Mexican-American War. And when he got there, he was captured. And the Mexican authorities gave him two options. They said, look, we know you've been helping Americans out in Texas, so you can either go right away into Mexican jail, or you can give some service to the Mexican army. And once again said, well, I sure as hell don't want to ride away into Mexican jail. I guess I'll join the Mexican service. And he ended up joining the Mexican army while they were fighting against the U.S. Later down the road, after his time of service was up, once again returned to the U.S. and was able to get his foot back into Texas politics very mildly. But he always faced fierce discrimination, and there's always all kinds of claims against him that, oh, he was a traitor, he had gone and served Mexico during the war. And eventually the pressure that he faced back in Texas just became to be so much that he ended up moving out of Texas and going to Mexico to escape the hardships that he was facing in the new U.S. Texas. That's a clear example of the discrimination faced by Tejanos after the Texas Revolution and definitely after the Mexican-American War. But Texas was just one section. Remember, there's this whole Mexican section, all that old California and New Mexico territory. There's somewhere up to 100,000 Spanish-speaking people of Mexican descent now being brought into the U.S. jurisdiction. And all these people living in this territory were given a choice. They said, you have 1 year to decide that you can either stay where you are, your land claims will be protected, and you'll automatically become a U.S. citizen with the same rights and protections as other U.S. citizens, or you will be given the option to leave your home, go down into current Mexican territory, and become a Mexican citizen. And the vast majority of these people here said, well, We have been living here for generations. This is our home. This is all we know. We don't want to go to unfamiliar territory in Mexico. So if you want to make us citizens, cool, that's fine. That'll be nice having the protections of citizens. As long as you're willing to protect our land claims, we'll stay here. In reality, though, these citizens in this territory were always treated as second class. I do want to clarify before I move on. This is kind of the basis of Mexican Americans being legally documented as white. Anybody who is Mexican American, on like your birth certificate, for example, and on legal forms, you'll see that your race is recorded as white. Reason for that is only white people could be citizens in the U.S. in this time. So to bring all these people of Mexican descent into the U.S., they had to be declared legally white. But they were always considered inferior to other white Americans, right? They were also definitely criticized and faced a good deal of discrimination because the majority of them were Catholic. They faced all kinds of violence. Many of them were thrown off of their properties. There were questions brought up about their right to their land claims. There'd be all kinds of technicalities. For example, they'd say, well, the U.S. agreed to protect your land claims given to you by Mexico, but you've been here so long that your land claims were under the Spanish government, and we don't recognize the Spanish government's land claims, so you need to pack up and go. In other cases, people would just come in with their guns and say, hey, I want to move in here. You better move out if you know what's good for you. Or you can stay here, but you're going to work as my laborers. So all kinds of hardships for the people living in this territory. For the indigenous peoples like the Comanches and other Plains Indian groups, many of them continued to deal with encroachment of Americans into the Southwest as the U.S. began to expand more and more into this Mexican cession and create more settlements. There was all kinds of incursions back and forth between Americans and American Indians. And these conflicts with Plains Indian groups like the Apaches and the Comanches would occur well after the U.S. Civil War, right? So this is not the end of the War of a Thousand Deserts. It's the end of the Mexican-American War as the U.S. starts moving out here. But in a sense, the War of a Thousand Deserts will continue to wage on for quite some time, all right? There's still going to be all kinds of conflicts between these Plains Indians and the U.S. Another key point of the aftermath of the Mexican-American War is what happened with California. There was gold discovered in California, and this led to a gold rush, rushing from all over the nation, as well as from other parts of the world, to California to try to get access to some of this gold. Now, there was all kinds of discrimination that was born out of this. So, for example, there were people coming here, as I suggested, from other parts of the world. There were large numbers of people, for example, coming from China, and they were frequently paid less by people who would pay miners to go out and mine the gold than U.S.-born white workers. So these American-born white workers started developing a big sense of nativism toward Chinese workers in particular, but really toward anybody who did not fit within their white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American-born mold. Okay, anybody who was not American-born white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, WASP as we call them, was faced with a good deal of discrimination and nativism. And nativists began collectively working to undermine the influence of anybody who did not fit within their mold. And to promote that, they even ended up developing a political party known as the Know Nothing Party. The reason they called themselves this is if they were ever questioned about any kind of discrimination or harm or intimidation caused by anybody within their party to undermine non-WASPs, their response would be to say, I know nothing about that. Clearly demonstrating just how intense the nativism was in the late 1850s as they're creating their own political party as a result of this. A lot of the people coming out to California as well during the gold rush, though, were enslavers, and they were bringing slave labor with them to help mine for their gold. Again, free laborers, predominantly white American free laborers, saw this as unfair competition. All right, so they're seeing enslavers have all these enslaved people helping them mine. So maybe one enslaver comes in from the South and he has, say, 5 enslaved people with him helping him mine for gold, whereas only one guy who's a free worker, they're competing with him to mine for gold. Maybe he can afford to hire one guy to help him out a little bit and split his earnings a little bit. He's going to see that as unfair competition. And for these economic concerns that people had about slavery, where they began to see slavery as an economic threat to free white labor, individuals began forming what was known as a Free Soil Party. Okay, so this comprised of both free laborers who saw the economic concerns they had with slavery and how they perceived it as potentially threatening to free white labor, as well as abolitionists, who were people who, again, had, we looked at before, who had moral qualms with slavery. These two groups came together to form this new Free Soil Party. This was a very sectional party. It was almost exclusively Northern. Now, you will see from one of the readings that you read that there were people down in the South who shared this free soil type of ideology. Okay, there were a lot of people who were concerned about how slavery might be hurting yeoman farmers and other poor white individuals down in the South. But this party that developed from these free laborers with that type of ideology, as well as abolitionists, was pretty exclusively Northern. The formation of this party, though, that's based all around concerns about slavery, whether they're economic or moral concerns, is demonstrating these growing concerns over slavery. They're starting to grow throughout the 1800s. And with these debates over slavery in mind, there were all kinds of debates that grew over the status of slavery in the Mexican Cession. There were all kinds of sectional conflicts between North and South over what to do with this territory. The North, of course, wanted to prohibit slavery from expanding into this territory. The South wanted to see as much of this as possible become slave territory. Clear example we can see of this debate was the Wilmot Proviso. So a proviso is just a piece added to a bill. Essentially, it's kind of an addition to a bill in the sense of something that's being suggested to become a law. And this was proposed by a congressman named David Wilmot, who added this addition to a bill in which he suggested that all of this Mexican cession should be free territory. That slavery should not be allowed at all to expand into this territory. Now, he was never able to get enough support for this thing to pass, but again, it's a clear demonstration that there is a growing sectional debate over the expansion of slavery. Okay, so we're seeing debates over slavery. We're seeing debates over an expansion of slavery. We're seeing growing nativism. We're seeing political parties being formed as a result of all of these things in response to this Mexican cession being acquired as a result of this Mexican-American War. So I cannot overstate just how crucial this Mexican-American War was to developing U.S. history in the latter half of the 1800s, and definitely toward leading into some of the tensions that would be prevalent up to the years of the Civil War and even following. Another major problem occurred in California when they were ready to become a state. Problem was they wanted to enter as a free state, but there had been no clear plan made for how slavery would be determined in this Mexican cession. So you may remember there had been the 3630 line drawn as part of the Missouri Compromise, saying that everything north of that line would be free and everything south of that line would be slave. Well, two problems there. That only pertained to the Louisiana Territory. This is not part of the Louisiana Territory. But say even in theory, if they just wanted to keep that line going as the divider of slavery, that line cuts straight through California. So really, there's been no propositions in terms of what to do with slavery that would resolve this issue here in California. So they're wanting to come in as a free state, but that would really throw off the balance of power. And there's all kinds of debates over what to do here. Some people are saying it must come in free. Others saying it must come in as a slave state. And this was all settled by the Compromise of 1850. So the Compromise of 1850 rests on 5 major conditions. First, California would enter as a free state as they wanted to. And to help maintain the balance of power, Utah and New Mexico territories here, these big hunks of territory, not just the present-day states of Utah and New Mexico, would be created. And in these territories, they would be allowed what was called popular sovereignty, meaning the people could rule for themselves and decide for themselves whether or not they wanted slavery in the states that developed out of these territories. So if any of these territories broke up and there's a section that was ready to become a state, the people in that territory that was going to become a state would vote whether or not they wanted that state to have slavery. Sounds like a good democratic idea. We'll see how it turns out. There's also a new stricter federal fugitive slave law put in place that required local governments to help capture enslaved people. It also gave local governments the authority to call on local citizens to form posses to help them capture enslaved people. It's also banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Notice I'm saying the slave trade. That doesn't mean there were no enslaved people in Washington, D.C. You just couldn't buy and sell enslaved people in Washington, D.C. All that means. And this also helped settle some territorial disputes between Texas and New Mexico. So this is solving some problems, but I'm going to suggest that just like the Missouri Compromise, this is just a temporary fix to the problem, okay? This is just putting a little Band-Aid on a much bigger problem that's being demonstrated here. The fact that they have to come to this kind of compromise clearly demonstrated that there were still growing sectional tensions over slavery and the expansion of slavery. And as these tensions are continuing to grow, it's very clear for us to see
this is kind of the beginning of the end of pre-Civil War America. These tensions aren't easing up at all. I got this little band-aid on it at the time for the Compromise of 1850. But if there's any disputes over how that popular sovereignty turns out, say, or if there's any other kind of disagreements, things could get really ugly. As they will, I'm giving you a spoiler alert. So stay tuned. We'll see where we go from here. This is it for now. Let me know if you get any questions. Otherwise, y'all have a good one. Over and out.